Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Beth-El Quarantine Book Talk series. And we're very excited to gather both over Zoom and on our Congregation Beth-El Facebook page this evening with author Leslie K. Berry to talk about her new novel, Newark Minutemen. I'll turn it over to Leslie in a moment. Leslie's novel is set in 1930s Newark. The Jewish community of Newark is something that our Beth-El community knows quite well. And it is a fictional tale. It is really historical fiction and focuses on how the Jewish mafia in Newark and the FBI work together to infiltrate the growing American Nazi movement at the time in our country. We'll turn it over to Leslie to tell us a bit about her story and her journey to writing this tale. And then we'll open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions, if you are on our Zoom, you can enter your question in the chat box, or if you're on our Facebook page, you can enter your question in the comment section, and I'll be sure to ask it when the time comes. But with that in mind, we turn it over to our author for this evening. Good evening, Leslie.
Hi, thank you very much, Rabbi Jesse. And I have to say, I'm so privileged to be talking to this group tonight, because where you all are is really the heart of where this story is set, around Newark, New Jersey. And out of every place in the world, I couldn't imagine talking to anybody, a group more important, and getting your feedback. As Rabbi Jesse said, this story called Newark Minutemen is based on a true story in the 1930s, and it does take place in Newark, and it's a love story. It's about a boxer, a Jewish boxer, who's recruited by the mob and the FBI to infiltrate what was called the German American Nazi Bund, which was essentially Hitler's arm in America, Nazi party that was taking over our country, whether we knew it or not. And a lot of people were ignoring it, but this was what was happening in the 1930s. And so first, I'll start with where did I get this idea? I have been told that many of you are native New Jerseyans, and that you're either kids or grandkids of many of the immigrants that came over from Russia or Europe. My mom, who's 95 now and still going strong, her parents came over from Russia, and she grew up with her 4 brothers and cousins and aunts and uncles in the 3rd Ward, and then Hawthorne and Nye Avenue. So growing up, my mom would tell us all these stories about her parents coming over and the hard times they had, the Depression, the wars, and all the horrors around it. And as we were kids, we kind of half listened. And then at her 90th birthday, which wasn't too long ago, she and her cousins started talking about her older brother, my Uncle Harry, and how he was a prize fighting boxer who won the Golden Glove at Madison Square Garden. And we've always seen the picture and the newspaper articles, so we knew all that. But then they started talking about how, remember when Uncle Harry used to go out and beat up the Nazis? And I kind of did a double take, and I'm like, what do you mean beat up the Nazis? And they're like, oh yeah, there was this group in America that was the Nazi party called the German American Bund, and he was part of a group that would go out and infiltrate and sort of disrupt some of the rallies and protest. And she said it was called the Newark Minutemen. And so I kind of came almost possessed with understanding the story. And I went out, and she and I went and talked to her cousins, and I started researching it. And I couldn't believe it. I had never heard the story growing up in school, and it never kind of clicked with me that there were these literally, and I can show you pictures later, but it looked like the German Nazis marching down, the avenues in New York and Newark and all over the United States for that matter. They were dressed in Hitler uniforms. They were doing the goose step, and they were waving American flag and Nazi flag side by side. And so again, I really wanted to understand what this part of history it was that I missed growing up. So it turned out that during the 1930s, and remember, this is the Depression, it's between the wars. It's well before World War II even happened. And in the area, especially of New York and Newark, New Jersey, which was the melting pot of, you had your Irish and your Germans and your Jews and Italians and all these different groups. This is the timing. So during this time, there was this rising Nazi party called the German American Bund. Again, it was, as I said, the sort of the arm of the Nazi party that just happened to be in America. They literally had an American Hitler. His name was Fritz Kuhn. And he had tens of thousands of members all across the United States. There were cells in every little town in the United States. And he ran this multi-million-dollar corporation that was made up of 6 companies. There was a newspaper. There was one of the organizations for the rallies. And one of the organizations was actually to run 25 Nazi youth camps across the country, 3 of them in New Jersey. They were Nazi camps that taught the children Hitler philosophy. They wore the uniforms. They learned military tactics. They learned to, shoot. And there's actually some really horrible stories too. The one in Long Island, this came out in FBI hearings later on, but it turned out that the one in Long Island was raping girls in order to increase the Aryan population in the United States. So, and then there was this big moment in 1939 that was sort of a culmination of Fritz Kuhn's effort in Madison Square Garden. He had a Nuremberg-like rally that filled the garden with 25,000 people. Everybody Heil Hitler, and again, I'll show you a little clip later on. And then outside, there were 200,000 protesters. And that's when finally this awareness of who is this guy and this Nazi in America. And then, 6 months later, the war started. So everybody was ignoring it. And then finally, people started realizing it. So why didn't we do something? Well, our government couldn't, because at the time there were, just kind of like now, First Amendment rights and rights for assembly. And there were some laws that came into play that tried to fight that. One of them was, one law was passed during this period when the German American Bund was becoming so powerful, where corporations weren't allowed to have freedom of speech rights. And that went on until it actually just changed back in 2010. But that was one of the ways they tried to stop some of the propaganda and assembly and rallies that were going on. So at the time, though, the government couldn't really do anything to stop some of this growing organization, which had all the same hate and ideals of Hitler. So they went to, they approached the mob, the Jewish mob. There was an Italian mob and the Jewish mob. They approached the Jewish mob. Meyer Lansky was the head of the mob in New York at the time. And the mob was pretty powerful back then. And because after the crash in 29, guess who had all the money and power? It was the mob. And so they were the ones all know the stories of gave people jobs and really ran the neighborhoods. And so the government, somebody from the FBI and a judge approached Meyer Lansky and said, look, Nazis are taking over America. We need your help. We'll pay you. And Meyer Lansky said, look, you don't need to pay me. Just look the other way and we'll take care of it. And so he got his group together, and these young kids would go out, and when there was a Nazi rally, they would start fighting and punch everyone. And it got a little out of hand, and they got some bad press. And so Meyer Lansky went over to his buddy in Newark, Longies Willman, who was the mob boss of Newark. And actually, my uncle used to cut his hair, and my mom grew up knowing him, and he was a real face in the neighborhood. Everybody in the neighborhood liked him. They called him the Gatsby of gangsters and the Robin Hood of the neighborhood. And in his own neighborhood, he really was supported everyone. So anyway, Lansky went over to Longies Woman, and he said, look, you have all these boxers, these prize fighting boxers. And for those, you may have heard this, but in the 20s and the 30s, there were more Jewish champion boxers than anywhere else in the country. And it was because, Jewish boys couldn't get any other jobs, so they boxed. But he went to Longy and he said, you have all these Jewish boxers. Can you put an organization together that can be more organized and disciplined, and go out and when we need it, disrupt some of the rallies, infiltrate this group, and try to stop them from spreading and growing? And so Longy went to, he took one of his retired boxers, his name was Nat Arno, and he said, Nat, I need you to kind of be a captain for me, that to sort of train our boxers and tell them the rules and prepare them to go out and fight the German-American Bund that's slowly taking us over, and everybody else is ignoring it. And so that's what they did. And my Uncle Harry was one of they called them the Newark Minutemen. They called them, I think somebody in a newspaper one time said, these guys are like the Minutemen. We need them and they're ready at a minute's notice. And they called them the Newark Minutemen because they were the special group. There were Minutemen in other towns too, but they were the ones that really trained and ready to go. So this is kind of all the landscape. And what I did for the story, so that's kind of all the true stuff. I created a love story over this setting, just like I was talking to some folks before, kind of like Titanic is this incredible historical story, and there's a love story set over it. So my love story is about Jewish boxer falls in love with the daughter who is the head of the German-American Bund. And obviously there's incredible tension and conflict between the two of them, crossing into one another's worlds and trying to understand one another's worlds. And along the way, the hero, his name is Yale, he is specifically recruited by the mob and the FBI to go undercover and infiltrate the mob with the goal of getting enough evidence to put Fritz Kuhn in jail. And that's his whole journey. So this is a story about, and by the way, what motivated him, the way the story starts is when he's a young boy. It's kind of a Batman story where he sees his father murdered by the German-American Bund members. And so his whole life is about avenge, getting back at that. And so you have this story of revenge and forbidden love, sort of a Romeo and Juliet, and this unholy alliance between the mob and the government, the U.S. government, to go out and take down these people that are taking over our country. And then there is also a big part of it is to bring in the story of the Nazi camps, the youth Nazi camps, Yale has this journey to go rescue Krista is the girl's name that he falls in love with. And so there's this whole sort of second story of him rescuing her from this Nazi camp. And is she going to come? Is she not going to come? There's, again, this whole, because obviously she grew up with this ideology, and so she's torn. And so to summarize, the story is, you've got boxers and you've got the mafia and the FBI, and you have Nazis and forbidden love. So I've hit on all the points. So what else do you need for an exciting historical fiction adventure? And as
Leslie, will you share about the screenplay as well?
Yes. So I actually started, this was originally a screenplay. And I'll admit it to this group, don't tell anyone, but I knew nothing about how to write a screenplay. So I just started putting the story down and getting lots of help. And my husband's in the business a little bit, so he helped me, and ended up in record time. Everybody said I couldn't do it, but I think the timing was right. Sold the screenplay to a group called Fulwell 73. And there are 4 Orthodox Jewish guys in Britain who totally got the story. And their 5th partner is James Corden, who does if any of you all have seen the Carpool Karaoke, and he does a lot of other late night show. And that's their LA office here. And right now we've gotten some, because we need some super duper screenwriters. So we have some great screenwriters, and we're looking for the director right now, which is a huge step, especially since everything is frozen in Hollywood. So we're moving along there. My mom's almost 95, so she keeps the whip on everybody, and hopefully that will be out soon as well.
Great. I'm wondering what led you started with the process of screenwriting first. What led you to take this next step and turn it into a novel?
Well, number one, what you learn is when you write a screenplay for Hollywood, the story is in the end going to never be your own. That was number one. Number two, it takes a long time. And so I kind of did it for my mom, really. I decided I wanted the story to be the real, the real story that I had originally come up with, and an IP, an intellectual property, and that I knew I could do it a lot faster. And so I did that pretty quickly too. It was a little challenging because I had already given away the movie rights, so to sell to a traditional publisher wasn't straightforward. So I sold to a publisher that they're distributing to all of the regular outlets, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all of them. And then I still get to keep all the other rights. So the actual paperback is out in December 1st. And they had asked me if I wanted to release the ebook early because of the shelter in. And so I released that in April. Thinking and I had no idea how to yet release a book. So I have my ebook out, but and ramping up for the paper book. And I just decided I was going to focus between now and December in terms of promoting it. And my first place I really wanted to focus was Newark, because I wanted to get the story to where it happened. And last week I spoke at one of your JCC Middlesex. And in a couple weeks I speak for the Newark Library. And so I want to sort of seed my, hopefully my biggest fans, and ramp up for the book and the movie.
That's great. Well, I was lucky. Leslie sent me a copy that I could take a sneak peek and read before this conversation. And I know that we have a select number of copies, and Adina Traub has access to those. So she'll share information at the very end if you'd like a copy, to order a copy through her. Before December, before the publisher releases them officially, so you get a head start on reading. Leslie, you're currently on the West Coast, yes?
Yes, in San Francisco area.
So I'm wondering, so many in our own community are so familiar with the history of Jewish Newark. We were talking before that one of the members of our community even gives tours. What did you not know about that history that was sort of revealed to you as you did your research?
You mean in the Newark area?
Correct.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the biggest thing I had never heard of was before World War II that the Nazis had such a foothold in our country. And again, as I got deeper and deeper into it, I just couldn't believe how close we came to having a Nazi party with maybe a presidential candidate. I mean, the way I actually met or learned about Jesse was because Jesse, you were doing your podcast about Plot Against America, and that's sort of, in a way, the sequel to my story of if Fritz Kuhn had been successful, they were looking at Charles Lindbergh to be president, and that could have been a very likely story. And I just didn't understand the gravity of really and truly what was happening. And I think my mom was young enough, she was a teenager at the time. She kind of knew, and her cousin knew, and Longy, he met at the candy store behind the, behind the candy store. So I knew all those sort of stories, but I never really understood the threat that was going on.
Sure. Just a reminder that if anybody has a question, you can enter it in the chat box, or if you're watching on Facebook Live on our Facebook page, you can enter it in the comment section and we'll be sure to ask it. Couple more questions from my end, if that's okay, before we ask questions from our viewers. I always find it fascinating, right? The story of a forbidden love, right? You mentioned Titanic, right? That's a separation of class, the Romeo and Juliet story of clashing families, and that certainly applies in your novel. I'm wondering, putting my rabbinic hat on, what it says about the American Jewish experience, that he was sort of simultaneously fighting anti-Semitism and also falling in love in a way with those who were taught to see him as less than, and what that speaks about our own experience as both previous generations who immigrated here to acculturate into American society, and even now.
That is a great question. And in fact, my mom, who grew up as an Orthodox Jew, I asked her a lot about how do I handle this? How do I handle this relationship? And I asked my older cousin too. So let's see. I don't want to give too much away, but and I hopefully I can. Let's see. This is kind of a sensitive thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. So my cousin especially said, look, for him, for the main character to like this girl that was not Jewish and German and definitely believed not only bad thing. Well, first of all, she was an American German. So let's remember that. She did come from Germany, but she wasn't a Nazi. She was a German American. So it was a little bit not as strong. And it was her father that was he was the one in the group. But regardless, so I said to my cousin, like, would a Jewish guy ever date a girl like that? A German girl who essentially her father's a Nazi and comes from this. And he goes, he would absolutely date her. He wouldn't marry her, but he'd go out with her. So that was part A. I'm like, okay, I can have a relationship, but how do I make it so it's more and more in love? And again, there's one part let's see, should I give it away?
No spoilers.
No spoilers. Okay, I can't do a spoiler, but I promise you, with my mom's help, I came up with a great solution. And then along the way, this girl is just tested on so many levels. And she finally realizes how wrong what they're doing is. And then there's a cherry on the top there as well. but I'll say one thing. It's really interesting because at one point I was deciding whether to do this young adult or adult. And when I was doing it young adult, somebody said to me, you know what? If you do it young adult, you're going to have to hire a sensitivity editor to make sure that, you know, is a Jewish Nazi, you know, how does that feel? And is that a good message and all of that? So it's a great question. And I struggled with it. And I think through the help of my mom, I think I solved it. I don't, did you read the whole thing, Jesse, or?
I'm not done yet.
Okay. All right. All right. Then I can't spoil it yet, but trust me, I solved it. And with the blessing of my mom, who would be very critical about that.
A couple questions just about your process. One, is this the first novel that you've written? And also, where do you expect the movie to be released? Will that be released hopefully in theaters or on streaming services? And knowing that there's a stoppage really in the industry right now due to this pandemic, do you have a timeline when you hope that movie will begin filming?
Let's see. First question was, what was the first question?
About is this your first novel?
Oh, it is my first novel. And I've started other novels before, but this is the first completed novel. And I have an idea for two more. One potentially a sort of a prequel to this, because I don't know why, but there's no real great, I don't think, stories about Longese Willman. And I think he's such an interesting character. And then the other one's another historical novel that's an American story that's never been told. So that's one. In terms of the timing of the movie, again, with this whole new world, well, let me step back. Before all this happened, we looked at, should this be a TV series or should it be a movie? We decided it should be a movie because it does sort of have a beginning, a middle, and an end, versus a character-driven series. Although we could see like a Newark Nazis type TV series, maybe a spinoff. But with all of this going on, I guess the good news is we're still in the pre-production, developing the story stage, and the challenges are more about filming. So while a lot of things have been canceled and reorganized, mine is still moving forward. So, but Hollywood is slow. So, but let's see, if I had to guess, I mean, not next year, maybe the year after. Yeah, would be and there was a middle question too, I think. Was there a middle question?
Is your hope that this will be released in theaters, I think was the question.
Yeah. I mean, it is big screen, definitely.
Great. Okay, well, so we'll mark our calendars for 2022.
Well, I'll keep you all. In fact, Sam can do we'll do some sort of premiere, and we'll do with Sam giving us a tour of Newark.
Yes, Sam, our resident Jewish Newark tour guide.
Yeah.
Going back to that, you know, we where our congregation is located, we're really less than a mile from the border of Newark. So many of our community members grew up in the Week Wake section of Newark, which was really one of the largest Jewish neighborhoods. What do you recommend in your deep dive into the history of Newark? What can the Jewish community in New Jersey do to strengthen our ties with the city of Newark, to sort of rebuild that connection? A city that really has a very small Jewish presence left there.
Well, you mean like big picture? What do I think?
Yeah.
Well, it's funny. For the Newark Library, I'm trying to get Cory Booker to do the interview with me so I can discuss it with him. But it's interesting. I mean, what I understand actually is, and you have to understand the lens I come through here, but I think, number one, the movie industry could be a great, I know New Jersey is incenting a lot of the movie industry with taxes, and I believe West Side Story was just filmed there, and they're going to do another Sopranos there,
And I
and
believe the Joker movie was filmed in Newark as well.
Joker. I think that that gives, number one, awareness to especially a new generation of Newark, and it's got so much history, and I know there's baggage that goes along with it, but I don't 100% know the answer, but I can tell you that doing the story and putting myself in my mom's shoes and talking to so many cousins, what a vital place it was. And I know there've been a lot of sort of, it should have grown and it didn't in certain ways. But I just think, helping people understand the history and making it more visible. And I guess, weren't they going to put Amazon there? I think they were going to put Amazon there, but they didn't, right?
Right, it was a finalist.
Yeah, finalist. Um, it just seems like it should. I mean, it should. It's one of those cities, and I'm from Maryland, and it's kind of like Baltimore as well. It seems like one of those cities that just it's such a great location. It's got a lot of great things going for it. Um, but I don't know, what are some of the solutions that people talk about?
That's why I asked you.
Okay.
No, I think I
Movies
think
coming.
we have many in our community who are deeply invested in Newark, and seeing the city thrive, remembering what a wonderful city it was from their own youth. And I think for many years, Newark we've been all waiting for it to take that next step. And we see that, and we see growing industry there. Personally, I'd be very interested to see the impact of this pandemic and what that has on companies leaving Manhattan, actually, and relocating to the suburbs, people commuting less into Manhattan, and companies expanding their growth in large metropolitan areas in New Jersey, like Newark. We see that already with some big companies like Audible that's in Newark. A couple questions for you. Next question from one of our viewers. Can you speak to your process of how you made sure the book was historically accurate in a historic fiction kind of way?
Yes. So it's my couple of my two biggest resources were all of the FBI documents that only came out about let's see, 220, I think about 8 years ago. And I think that's why a lot of people haven't sort of gotten their hands around the story yet. But I came across and went through like thousands of pages of FBI documents that were hearings of once the war started, people started opening their eyes, and then there were all these hearings about the camps and Fritz Kuhn, and putting Fritz Kuhn behind bars, and how they got him. So number one was a ton of FBI hearing documents. Number two was an incredible book. Shoot, I can't remember the name of it, but it was written by a guy who was a social studies teacher in 1970, who came across these Nazi camps and became so fascinated, he quit his job and he went around the country interviewing all the kids that used to be in these camps. And the book is out of print, but I found one and I bought it. And it's an amazing, amazing detailed book of his interviews, and also his proof. There was a big controversy of whether Fritz Kuhn and the American Bund were tied to Hitler or not tied to Hitler. And he proved that they were tied. And I kind of believed his rationale because he had so much research, because he followed the money trail. There were a couple presidents of the big banks, including Chase, that they would get some of the German Americans to give American dollars for this special German mark that at a very high interest rate. And the deal was that they got that money when they had to agree to go back to Germany by 1939 to get that money. And why would they agree to that? Because they believed Germany was going to start and win a war. So, so that was my second incredible resource. And my third one was so I'm really into ancestry. I think somebody else, Dan or somebody also said they were. And I do some of my research about people sometimes on Ancestry, and I was researching my hero, Yale, is modeled after, there were two brothers, John and Jim Metcalf, in 1936, who, they were Germans, they were American Germans, but not German American bun, they were Americans. And Jim was with the FBI, and John worked for the Chicago Times. And the Chicago Times, they organized for the two brothers to go undercover for 6 months. And then after the 6 months, this 12-day story was printed every day in the Chicago Daily Times about this German American bun and what was going on. And when I was on Ancestry researching John Metcalf, there was this little tiny mice type in the bottom that said, all of John's diaries are at the Hoover Institute. Well, the Hoover Institute is right near me at Stanford University. And so I'm like, I never really knew that much about it, but I'm like, okay, I'm going to sign up. And I went down, and it's like one of these places you literally go down underneath, and it's in this vault, and you have to turn over all your, I got to keep my iPhone, but everything else. And I went in there with a friend of mine who's actually, he was a newspaper publisher, because I didn't understand what I was going to find. And we found 12 boxes of John Metcalf's notes that he kept during this time. And they were so incredibly detailed. And I ended up getting in touch with his son, and he gave me permission. He goes, use whatever you want. And so I used a lot of there's one of the biggest detail things I use is the initiation, when Yale goes undercover and is initiated to become a stormtrooper. And I used that whole ceremony is true. And so those are my three big things. Then I learned about different other archives that were available. But at one point, somebody said to me, your problem is you have too much information. And it was trying to make this feel like you weren't really reading a history book. But if anything, I can definitely claim this is so well researched. And what I have done, just so you understand, is I've taken a couple of the characters and combined them. The girl, Krista, is actually modeled after a couple women, but one of them is this woman, Helen Vrurus, who was the woman in Long Island, and she testified at the FBI hearings about the rapes that were going on. And so so I've combined certain characters, I've condensed certain timelines to make it readable, and especially when I was doing the movie, I needed to do that. So I would say about 85% of it is truly true, and the other 15% or so is, this made-up love story. My uncle is Yale's friend, Harry, so I sort of kept him to the side a little bit. But certainly there are all the scenes about life and Harry's home and all that was all about my mom's story. My cousin, I think I mentioned So my mom's cousin was about her age. She just recently passed, but her father was Long E. Zwillman's barber, and they lived next door to the candy store where all the mafia would go in the back. And so that's how I got a lot of those personal. Oh, the other thing I did actually was, so my mom is a graduate of Weequahic High. She knows the whole, the chant they say. And my cousin also went there as well. And so he actually, to the alumni group, he sent out something that said we were working on this, and if anybody had any anecdotes about the Newark Minutemen, if they could send them to us. So we got a lot of stories that way as well.
That's great. Another question, I guess a follow-up on that from Deb, who received an advanced copy also and finished it, and she says she loved it.
Oh,
Are there other historical fiction books of the same era, besides your research, that you also used as a model? And can you speak even more about really your literary inspiration for writing this?
so let's see, what other, I mean, Plot Against America, I read years and years ago, and that was sort of floating in my head. And then when I went back and looked at it, I was surprised, and I just saw the TV series too, how much they mentioned Longy and Fritz Kuhn. And so I would say that was definitely an influence. Um, there were a couple other, there were two Nazis in Newark, that especially the first part of it goes into some of the stories about the boxers. Um, those were probably book wise. And then this other one, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it. It's got a weird German name that I forget. Other fictions, I mean, I've read like alternative um, stories, or let's see, what was the one on Amazon about the Nazis taking over?
Hunters.
But not Hunters. It was on Amazon. It was not the basically it was a story that the Nazis won and Japan took half the.
Oh, the man in the high
Yeah,
castle.
Man in the High Castle. That's different though, because that's a little more sci-fi and alternative universe. But again, I mean, some of this just this story wasn't there, especially the whole thing, the relationship between the mob and the FBI, because I think that was secret and nobody really talked about that. Um, and then I'm sorry, the second question about was,
Sharing more about your literary inspiration.
my literary inspiration. Um, um, really, this was driven by something else. It was driven by more of a family story and an American story that had never been told. And if anything, it was about that. And then I started doing it for my mom. And then it became, as I wrapped my head around it, I became very sort of committed or whatever to saying this was complacency, and we cannot be complacent. And I started sort of pounding my own drum about that. This is my message here. Don't be complacent. Don't close your eyes, because this can happen again. And like, some of it's happening now. So I would say it was less of a literary influence and more of a possession about a message that became very personal to me.
So maybe your last point is a good segue to a more challenging and difficult question. Right, complacency leads to history repeating itself.
Mhm.
In the research that you did and understanding what the Newark Minutemen did to really stand up to Nazis, to literal Nazis in our country in the 30s, and seeing the past couple of years the spike in anti-Semitic attacks in this country, to those with the largest megaphones and highest soap boxes and frequent Twitter accounts, those in the highest positions of power, using their voices to stoke these flames of bigotry. I would say not just against Jews. We see this against many minority groups. How do we respond, right, at this crossroads that so many of us feel that we're at, a crossroads in our nation's future? Do we infiltrate these groups, right? Do we get physical like these boxers did, and we see somebody who says something hateful about us and go and kick the crap out of them? How do we take the high road? I know that that's an impossible question to ask.
I guess the scary thing is, and it's a little knee-jerk here, but I guess the scary thing is some people are on whatever, on probably both sides, are getting prepared for, I guess we're at a time right now where, so Americans are losing faith in the system. And I think when people lose faith in the system, you look for guidance elsewhere. Like in the 1930s, people looked for guidance to the left and to the right. And on one side you had Nazis, on the other side you had communists, and we were looking for guidance. I mean, a lot of people say FDR was, took a communist approach where the government was helping the country get through this depression. So I think people are all of a sudden saying, okay, where we are is scary and doesn't seem like our feet are on the ground here. So let's look around us, and some solutions are, pull down the fight, and the other is maybe pacifist, maybe let's just take care of everyone. But the problem is then you have all the blame, and then everybody starts blaming everyone, and that's where the hatred and the supremacy come along. So and maybe it's because I'm fresh off this book, but I am nervous about this feeling of revolution and division. And so what do you do? Nobody wants it to go to violence, but it seems like some of it is going to violence, and it seems like some people are being prepared. I mean, I've heard of different groups that are, storing guns in their basement, and so then what does that say? If they're going to do that, do I need to protect myself? I think it's challenging all of these thoughts that our generation didn't grow up with. It's interesting. I read an article about what was it, in 1968? There was a huge pandemic in 1968, yet there was no lockdown like right now. And why? I mean, that was when what was the big music concert?
Woodstock.
Yeah, Woodstock. I mean, there was a pandemic during that. People were crawling over each other. There was a huge pandemic, and everybody was getting so sick. And why didn't people care? And some people say, well, they didn't care because they were either in the war or their brothers were in the war, and they were just used to that. And the problem is, some of our generation, that's so foreign to us. But it wasn't that long ago. And I think some of this stuff can happen again. And the answer is leadership for sure. But right now, I think we're so divided, and it's scary. I
wonder, I think what really speaks to me, that how Krista changes her perspective only once she is willing to fall in love with a Jew. And she realizes that the way she was brainwashed was not truth. And so it's the balance that we find between how do we stand up to hatred towards us or towards anybody, but also how do we constantly try to educate others about what we believe to be true and authentically real, because we also know this about ourselves, right? The only way you stand up for the other is when you yourself don't see the other as the other, right? That they're not different, they're not foreign, but they are our neighbor, they are our friends, they are our child's, the person who sits next to our child in the classroom. That's our challenge. Right, I sort of imagine if Yale, this character, said, "Up, I can't go near this woman because I'm going to stay in my bubble of Jewish Newark," then she would have never changed her own thought process. One of the comments from our viewers, right, says, right, that's why the connection with others is so important, whether it be race, religion, gender identity, or sexual orientation or other. It's about allyship and understanding that we're all connected, and that's injustice, right? As Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And yet, we also have no patience, right? We're not going to try to be friends with somebody who says, "I hate you because of how you are." We're going to stand up for our own survival. And so how do we find that balance between allyship and educating ourselves, and also standing up towards hatred and bigotry wherever it comes from and whenever it's thrown our way or anybody else's way?
Right, and I also think this whole it's so hard sometimes to know who's telling the truth and who's telling the whole. There's so much propaganda, if you will, now on social media, and understanding the sources of where things are coming from and who to believe. And I think that's an extra layer of education that needs to happen.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know if just looking to see if there are any last questions. Well, thank you, Leslie, for joining us this evening. We're so grateful. Again, the book is Newark Minutemen. I can't wait to finish reading my copy. And if you are part of our community, you can click on the link, the calendar link on our website. There's also information in our weekly emails about how to contact Adina Traub to get your advanced copy before it's released by the publisher. You can also get the e-copy if you like. E-copy is available on Amazon, correct?
Yes, ebook is, or you can pre-order that book, or I can get you books through my channels as well. And I'll make all of you extras in the movie, hopefully, if it's filmed in Newark. So keep in touch.
If you need a rabbi
Yeah,
for the
absolutely.
film.
Or a fish lady. You can be a fish lady or whatever, a rabbi. Yeah.
I'll bring back my middle school community theater days. So thank you, everybody also who joined us on Facebook Live, and everybody who joined us on our Zoom.